The first thing you feel is the damp. It's a permanent condition, a cold that seeps up from the packed earth floor of the single room you share with 6 others. It clings to the thin blanket and infuses the very air you breathe, which already tastes of coal smoke and boiled cabbage. Listen. Beyond the incessant coughing of your younger brother, you can hear the city's heart murmur, the distant rumble of iron-shod wheels on cobblestones, the shrill whistle of a factory, the low drone of a million lives packed tightly together. The year is 1885, and you are a child in the East End of London. Through the single, grime-streaked pane of glass, the lights of another world, the world of the West End, are a faint, mocking glow in the perpetual fog. You know nothing of that world, with its carriages and gas lamps and houses with more rooms than you have family members. You only know this one, a world where hunger is a constant companion and the future is a space as narrow and dark as the alleyway outside your door. This sensory landscape was not a work of fiction. It was the lived reality for the majority of London's populace. As we prepare to sift through the primary sources of this era, pause to like this chronicle and subscribe to our society. But only if you share our dedication to giving a voice to history's silent victims. In the comments below, we invite you to share your thoughts on the historical figure you believe is most misunderstood and why. And now the preamble is over. Let us turn to the primary sources and begin the slow work of reconstruction. The London of the late 19th century was a city of profound and irreconcilable contradictions. It was the administrative heart of the largest empire the world had ever known, a global hub of finance, industry, and trade. Its population had exploded, quadrupling over the century to more than 4 million souls by the 1882. This was the city of the Great Exhibition of 1851, a monument to progress and technological supremacy. It was the city of Sir Joseph Bossuet's revolutionary sewer system, of the nascent Underground Railway, of vast new parks, museums, and grand public buildings, in the immaculate squares of Belgravia and Mayfair. The aristocracy, the new industrial magnates, lived lives of unimaginable opulence, insulated from the city's harsher realities by wealth, social protocol, and geography. Their world was one of debutante balls, parliamentary debates, private clubs, and a rigid moral code that prized public piety and respectability above all else. Yet, this gilded facade concealed a darker, more populous reality. A mere few miles to the east, but a world away in experience, lay the sprawling, labyrinthine districts of Whitechapel, Spitalfields, and Bethnal Green. Here, the forces of the Industrial Revolution had concentrated a vast and desperate workforce. These were the rookeries, teeming tenement blocks where entire families often subsisted in a single, unventilated room without running water or sanitation. The official reports of social investigators from the period, such as Charles Booth, provide a clinical analysis of the conditions. Infant mortality rates in these areas were staggeringly high, often exceeding 150 deaths per 1,000 live births. Diseases like tuberculosis, cholera, and typhoid were endemic, fueled by overcrowding uncontaminated water sources. Life expectancy for a labourer in the East End was decades shorter than for a gentleman in the West End. This physical and economic chasm was reinforced by a pervasive social ideology. The prevailing philosophy of laissez-faire capitalism suggested that poverty was a personal failing, a symptom of idleness or moral deficiency, rather than a systemic consequence of industrialization. While a culture of philanthropy did exist, with reformers and religious organizations establishing missions and soup kitchens, their efforts were a fragile dam against a relentless tide of human misery. For hundreds of thousands, survival depended on precarious, low-wage labor in factories, sweatshops, and the sprawling London docks. It was within this environment of extreme social stratification that a hidden economy of vice was allowed to flourish. The desperation of the poor created a vulnerable population, while the wealth and perceived impunity of certain segments of the elite created a demand for illicit services. The very structure of the city, with its starkly divided districts, facilitated this secret commerce. A gentleman could travel a short distance by cab from his respectable life into a world that operated by a different set of rules, a world where anything, and anyone, could be procured for the right price. Public morality demanded a veneer of impeccable virtue, yet this very repression fostered a thriving underworld where desires forbidden in polite society were catered to in the shadows. This fundamental hypocrisy, the chasm between the public pronouncements of Victorian morality and the private practices of some of its most, created the fertile ground upon which the events we are about to examine would grow. The machinery of exploitation was already in place, operating quietly in the dark spaces between two Londons. All that was needed was for someone to turn on the light. The machinery of exploitation that operated within Victorian London was not merely a consequence of social and economic disparity, it was enabled and, in some respects, sanctioned by the prevailing statutory framework. While the city's surface was governed by a complex and ever-expanding body of law, the specific protections afforded to its most vulnerable citizens, particularly female children, were profoundly inadequate. The legal architecture of the era, when examined closely, reveals not a shield but a collection of gaps and loopholes through which predators could operate with a considerable degree of impunity. At the heart of this legal failure was a single, starkly insufficient number, codified in the law of the land. The age of consent for females was 13. This threshold was not an ancient relic but a relatively recent legislative decision. The Offences Against the Person Act of 1861 had set the age at 12. A subsequent amendment in 1875 raised it by a single year to 13. To the modern observer, this figure is shocking, but it reflected a Victorian jurisprudence that oft unconflated the protection of a child with the protection of a father's property rights. A daughter's virginity was seen, in certain legal contexts, as a tangible asset, and its loss before marriage was a violation against the head of the household. The concept of a child's own bodily autonomy and psychological well-being was a nascent and poorly articulated idea within the courts. Therefore, a sexual act with a girl of 13 was, in the eyes of the law, a consensual act between two individuals, absolving the adult male of the charge of rape. Even in cases involving girls below this minimal age, the path to justice was fraught with systemic obstacles. The burden of proof was immense. A successful prosecution for defilement often rested entirely on the testimony of the child victim. In a courtroom environment dominated by male barristers and judges from the upper classes, the word of a poor, often uneducated child from the slums carried little weight against that of a socially prominent gentleman. The very process of giving evidence could be a traumatic ordeal designed to discredit the child's account. Furthermore, the law provided defendants with a powerful and frequently used defense. A man accused of assaulting a girl between the ages of 12 and 13 could be acquitted if his legal counsel could successfully argue that he had reasonable cause to believe the girl was of or above the age of consent. This provision shifted the legal focus from the perpetrator's actions to the victim's physical appearance. It created a grotesque paradox. The very conditions of poverty, malnutrition, child labor, and chronic illness that made girls vulnerable to exploitation could also cause them to appear physically older than their chronological age, thereby providing their abusers with a ready-made legal excuse. The law, in effect, punished the victim for the visible markers of her own suffering. The legal distinctions surrounding prostitution further complicated matters. While laws existed against brothel keeping unsoliciting, they were enforced with notorious inconsistency. Fines were often treated as a simple business expense by the madams and procurers who ran the trade. More insidiously, when a child was involved in commercial sexual activity, the legal system tended to view her as a juvenile prostitute or a delinquent rather than as a victim of exploitation. This shifted culpability onto the child, framing her as morally corrupt rather than as a subject of abuse. The entire system was ill-equipped to address the complex dynamics of coercion, economic necessity, and grooming that funneled children into this trade. The enforcement apparatus itself was a product of the era's social stratification. Police constables in the East End were overwhelmed, under-resourced, and often desensitized by the sheer scale of the poverty and crime they witnessed daily. There was little institutional will or capacity to investigate complex vice networks that often involved clients from the other side of the city. The social and political cost of pursuing a wealthy and powerful individual for crimes against a slum child was prohibitively high. An accusation could be easily dismissed as blackmail, and the accuser left to face the consequences alone. Thus, the law as written and as practiced was a blunt and ineffective instrument against this specific form of organized abuse. It created a low-risk environment for the purchasers and a high-risk world for the victims, a legal vacuum that social reformers and campaigners were beginning to recognize could not be filled through the courts alone. A different, more shocking method would be required to force the hand of a complacent parliament. Into this environment of legal inadequacy and social hypocrisy stepped a figure uniquely equipped to challenge the status quo. The force that would ultimately expose the rot of the imperial capital was not a politician or a lawman, but a journalist. His name was William Thomas Stead, and the instrument of his crusade was a London evening paper, the Pall Mall Gazette. To understand the explosive events of 1885, one must first understand the confluence of moral fervor and journalistic innovation that Stead represented. He was not a dispassionate chronicler of events. He was an active and often reckless participant in the shaping of public opinion, a man who viewed his newspaper less as a record of history and more as a battering ram against the doors of indifference. Born in 1849, the son of a Congregationalist minister, Stead was raised in the nonconformist tradition, a background that imbued him with a powerful, almost puritanical, sense of social duty and moral righteousness. He was not a product of the London elite or the Oxbridge establishment. He began his career in the provinces, editing the Northern Echo in Darlington, where he honed a campaigning style of journalism that was both aggressive and highly effective. When he was appointed editor of the Pall Mall Gazette in 1883, he brought this provincial energy and crusading zeal to the very centre of British public life. Under Stead's editorship, the Pall Mall Gazette was transformed. He was a primary architect of what came to be known as the New Journalism. This was a stark departure from the staid, densely printed columns that characterized most of the Victorian press. Stead introduced modern techniques designed to seize the reader's attention and drive a narrative. He pioneered the use of the crosshead or subheading to break up long blocks of text. He popularized the interview format, sending reporters to directly question public figures, a practice then considered somewhat impertinent. He made extensive use of illustrations and maps to make complex stories more accessible and visually engaging. More fundamentally, Stead changed the very purpose of his newspaper. He did not see it as a passive recorder of parliamentary debates and foreign affairs. He saw it as a secular pulpit and a tool for social engineering. He famously declared that the role of an editor was akin to that of a captain on the bridge of a ship, directing the vessel of state. The paper's self-appointed role was to be the national conscience. He launched ambitious, often sensationalist, investigative campaigns on topics he deemed of national importance. One of his most famous early crusades was The Truth About the Navy in 1884, a series of articles that exposed the weakness of the Royal Navy and successfully pressured the government into a massive program of naval expansion. This campaign demonstrated his ability to harness the power of the press to influence policy at the highest level. This journalistic approach was, by its very nature, controversial. Critics accused Stead of sensationalism, of sacrificing journalistic objectivity for the sake of a good story, and of dangerously blurring the line between reporting the news and making it. He was seen as loud, moralistic, and self-aggrandizing. Yet his methods were undeniably effective. He understood how to create a moral panic, how to simplify a complex issue into a compelling narrative of good versus evil, and how to mobilize his middle-class readership into a potent political force. He was, in essence, building a powerful weapon, a media engine capable of focusing public outrage with unprecedented intensity. By early 1885 W.T. Stead was a formidable figure in London. He had the ear of politicians, the respect of social reformers, and a direct line to the drawing rooms and breakfast tables of the influential classes. He was a man in search of a crusade, one that would match the scale of his ambition and the depth of his moral convictions. He had already proven he could force the government to build more battleships to protect the empire's body. A new set of whispers and reports were beginning to circulate among the city's reformers. Stories of a far more insidious threat that was rotting the empire's soul from within. This new cause would require the full and ethically fraught deployment of his journalistic arsenal, pushing his methods, and the man himself, to their absolute limit. The cause that would galvanize W.T. Stead did not arrive as a single dramatic revelation, but as a slow, toxic seepage from the city's underbelly. For several years, a persistent and foul murmur had been circulating among the small, dedicated community of London social reformers. These were not official reports or statistical abstracts, but a collection of fragmented, anecdotal, and deeply disquieting accounts passed on by those who worked directly in the city's poorest district. They were echoes from an underworld that polite society preferred to believe did not exist, whispers of a systematic trade in human flesh, specifically the flesh of children. The primary conduits for this information were the frontline soldiers of Victorian philanthropy, the Salvation Army, under the leadership of its founder William Booth and his son Bramwell, had deployed its slum sisters throughout the East End. These women, living and working in the same squalid conditions as the people they served, became confessors and trusted confidanters. They heard stories from distraught mothers whose daughters had vanished after being offered positions in domestic service. They encountered traumatized children who had escaped from situations they could barely articulate. These accounts, collected in mission halls and soup kitchens, began to form a terrifying mosaic. They suggested not random acts of depravity, but an organized, almost commercial process. Similar narratives were being gathered by other organizations dedicated to child rescue and the rehabilitation of fallen women. The London Society for the Prevention of Cruelty to Children, a forerunner of the modern NSPC, received reports that were often dismissed by the authorities as familial disputes or the fabrications of delinquent youths. Figures like Josephine Butler, who had long campaigned against the Contagious Diseases Acts, were aware of the international dimensions of this trade, with evidence suggesting that young British girls were being trafficked to brothels on the continent, particularly in Belgium and France. The rumors all pointed towards a coherent if clandestine system. The process allegedly began with the procureuress, often a respectable-looking older woman, who would identify a vulnerable family in a poor neighborhood. Under the guise of charity or the promise of legitimate employment, she would gain the mother's trust. A small sum of money would be offered, framed as an advance on wages, to secure the daughter for a position in a good house. The child would then be taken, not to a life of service, but to a specific type of brothel that specialized in catering to a niche and expensive taste, the procurement of virgins for wealthy clients. The price, it was whispered, was remarkably low, a testament to the cheapness of a poor child's life. The great frustration for the reformers who heard these stories was their inability to act. The evidence was entirely anecdotal. The victims, if they could be found, were often too terrified of reprisal or too deeply ashamed to testify in a public court. Their families were powerless, easily intimidated, and sometimes complicit out of sheer desperation. When reformers did attempt to bring cases to the police, they were met with indifference or outright skepticism. The authorities were reluctant to investigate what they saw as vice, not organized crime, and they possessed little appetite for inquiries that might lead to the drawing rooms of powerful men. One of the key figures collecting this data was Benjamin Scott, the Chamberlain of the City of London, a man whose official position gave him a unique vantage point on the city's workings. For years he had been quietly gathering a file of these disturbing reports, convinced that a vast conspiracy of silence was protecting a network of high society pedophiles. He, along with Bramwell Booth of the Salvation Army, had reached a maddening impasse. They possessed a moral certainty that a monstrous evil was flourishing in their city, but they lacked the legal proof required to compel the system to act. The law was blind, the police were inert, and Parliament was oblivious. They understood that to break the deadlock, they needed a different kind of power. They needed a weapon capable of creating a public scandal so enormous that it could not be ignored. It was this calculated desperation that led them to the offices of the Pall Mall Gazette. They needed a man with a powerful platform, a national audience, and a demonstrated willingness to engage in confrontational, high-risk journalism. They needed someone who could take their whispers and rumors and amplify them into a roar that would shake the very foundations of the establishment. They needed W.T. The streams of information, having seeped out of the slums and into the mission halls, were now converging on a single point: the desk of an editor who was about to be presented with the most shocking and dangerous story of his career. The meeting, when it occurred, was an assembly of disparate but equally determined forces. It took place away from the public gaze within the Northumberland street offices of the Pall Mall Gazette. The participants represented three distinct pillars of Victorian society: the church, the state, and the press. There was Bramwell Booth, the pragmatic chief of staff for the Salvation Army, a man driven by a profound Christian evangelism and a first-hand knowledge of urban destitution. There was Benjamin Scott, the venerable Chamberlain of the City of London, a respected official who embodied the civic establishment, yet was privately horrified by the corruption he had observed. And there was William T. Stead, the editor, the firebrand of the new journalism, a man who saw in their proposition the convergence of his moral duty and his professional ambition. Booth and Scott laid out their case. They did not speak in generalities but presented the specific, harrowing collection of anecdotal evidence they had spent years accumulating. They spoke of the Slum Sisters' reports, of the consistent pattern of procurement under the guise of domestic service, or the whispers of elite clientele, and of the impenetrable wall of indifference they had encountered from the police and the judiciary. They explained the legal paradoxes that protected the perpetrators, focusing on the tragically low age of consent and the legal defenses available to the accused. Their presentation culminated in a single, frustrating point: they were morally certain of a vast, organized evil, but they possessed not a single piece of evidence that would stand up in a court of law, or in the court of law, or in the court of public opinion. Their file was thick with smoke, but it contained no fire. Stead listened with an intensity that his collaborators would later recall vividly. He was not a man to be swayed by mere sentiment. He was a master strategist of public opinion. As Booth and Scott spoke, he was not just absorbing the moral horror of their account, he was deconstructing it, analyzing its narrative potential, and identifying its key components: the innocent victim, the shadowy villain, the systemic corruption. This was not merely a story, it was a crusade in waiting, a perfect vehicle for the kind of campaigning journalism he had perfected. It possessed the power to shock the nation out of its complacent slumber. His response, therefore, was not one of tentative agreement but of immediate and total commitment. He saw at once that simply publishing the reformers' second-hand accounts would be insufficient. The accusations were too monstrous. They would be dismissed as hysterical exaggerations, or worse, as a libelous attack on the upper classes. From this initial meeting, a secret investigative committee was formalized. The three men formed its nucleus, a triumvirate of conviction. They understood that their endeavor required absolute secrecy. Any leak would not only scupper the investigation, but would expose them to potentially ruinous legal challenges and public ridicule. They were, in effect, forming a conspiracy, albeit one dedicated to a moral end. The group soon expanded to include other trusted individuals, each chosen for specific skills. They recruited a solicitor to provide legal counsel, ensuring their actions remained, as much as possible, within the tortuous bounds of the law. They brought in members of the Salvation Army who had the necessary experience to navigate the city's labyrinthine underworld. The objective of this secret committee was clear and specific. It was not merely to expose child prostitution. The ultimate goal was political: to force the passage of the Criminal Law Amendment Bill. This piece of legislation, which proposed raising the age of consent from 13 to 16, had been languishing in Parliament for years. It had been repeatedly delayed, debated into oblivion, and obstructed by a combination of legislative inertia and a quiet but powerful lobby of MPs, who were either indifferent to the issue or, as some suspected, had a vested interest in maintaining the status quo. Stead and his committee understood that only a public scandal of unprecedented magnitude, an explosion of public opinion, as he would later call it, could provide the political dynamite necessary to blast the bill through the House of Commons. Thus, the alliance was forged not just on shared moral outrage, but on a cold, strategic calculation. They were moving beyond the traditional roles of charity and reporting. Booth's army would provide the on-the-ground intelligence network. Scott would lend the weight of his civic authority and his private files, and Stead would wield the power of the press to weaponize their findings. Each man was taking an immense personal risk. Scott was placing his long and distinguished career in jeopardy. Booth was risking the reputation of his nascent religious movement, which could be tainted by association with such a sordid affair, and Stead was preparing to wager his newspaper, his liberty, and his very future on the outcome. The decision was made. They would not simply report on the system of child procurement. They would find a way to document its inner workings from start to finish. They were no longer chroniclers of a tragedy. They were about to become its principal actors. As the secret committee deliberated on its strategy, a consensus emerged. Anecdotal evidence and second-hand reports were insufficient to shatter the public's ingrained denial and overcome the inevitable accusations of sensationalism. They needed irrefutable first-hand proof. They needed to demonstrate, in painstaking, sequential detail, that the process of procuring a child for immoral purposes was not a rare and difficult crime but a routine, almost trivial, commercial transaction. It was in one of these clandestine meetings that W.T. Stead, with his characteristic flair for the dramatic and the radical, articulated the proposition that would define the entire enterprise. He declared that he would not merely investigate the trade, he would become a customer. The proposal was, on its face, morally and legally perilous. Stead argued that the only way to prove that a virgin child could be bought for £5 was to actually buy one. He would personally commission the procurement, document every step of the process, and then publish the entire, sordid affair as an unimpeachable piece of investigative journalism. This was a quantum leap beyond the accepted boundaries of his profession. He was proposing to move from observer to active participant, to commit a series of acts that, taken out of context, constituted serious crimes, including abduction and procurement for immoral purposes. He intended to stage a crime in order to expose a greater, systemic criminality. The idea was met with profound apprehension by his collaborators. Bramwell Booth, the man of deep religious conviction, was particularly troubled by the ethical implications. To participate, even with the noblest of intentions, in a transaction that treated a human being as chattel was deeply problematic. Benjamin Scott, the man of law, was acutely aware of the immense legal risks. Their actions, if discovered, could not be easily explained away as a journalistic investigation. They would be judged by the letter of the law, which made no provision for well-intentioned criminality. A conviction could lead to lengthy prison sentences and the complete discrediting of their cause. The potential for the entire scheme to backfire was enormous. A single misstep could transform them from social reformers into convicted criminals, their exposed dismissed as the sordid fantasy of a disgraced editor. Stead, however, was adamant. He countered their concerns with a powerful, if ethically complex, argument. He contended that their actions constituted a form of moral necessity. The suffering of thousands of children was a known but ignored reality. The legislative process had failed. The legal system was complicit through its inaction. Therefore, an extraordinary, even shocking, act was required to break the paralysis. He framed his proposition not as a crime, but as a form of human experiment, a clinical demonstration of a social pathology. By meticulously documenting the purchase, he would provide the indisputable fact evidence that the public and Parliament could no longer deny. He was willing to become the villain of a small, controlled narrative in order to expose the villainy of an entire class. His powers of persuasion, combined with the reformers' own desperation, eventually won the day. The committee gave its reluctant consent, convinced by Stead's argument that the potential reward, the passage of the protective legislation, outweighed the colossal risks. The decision transformed the nature of their project. It was no longer simply an investigation, it was now a covert operation with sting. They would have to adopt the methods of the underworld. They sought to expose deception, misdirection, and the use of intermediaries with questionable pasts. The plan was audacious in its simplicity. Stead himself would play the role of the purchaser, the dissolute aristocrat seeking a novel depravity. Members of his team would act as go-betweens, making contact with the network of procurers as CS they had identified through their preliminary research. They would need to find a woman with intimate knowledge of the trade who could be persuaded to help them. They would need to identify a real family who fit the profile of the victims. Most critically, they would need to establish a set of safeguards to ensure that the child, once purchased, would be immediately removed from harm's way and placed in a secure location, far from the scandal that was about to erupt. Every stage of the operation had to be planned with precision, for they would be walking a legal and ethical tightrope. with ruin on one side and a profound social victory on the other. With the committee's nervous approval, Stead set the plan in motion. The journalist was about to become a conspirator. With the radical proposition accepted, the secret committee transitioned from a body of moral deliberation into the nerve center of a clandestine field operation. The immediate and formidable challenge was one of access. W.T. Stead, Benjamin Scott, and Bramwell Booth were men of influence and public standing. They could not simply descend into the rookeries of the East End and begin making inquiries about the procurement of children without instantly attracting suspicion and derailing the entire enterprise. They needed a proxy, a guide who could navigate the complex social topography of the underworld. Their first task, therefore, was to systematize their existing, anecdotal knowledge and create a functional map of London's corridors of vice. The primary intelligence-gathering arm of this operation was, by necessity, the Salvation Army. Unlike any other organization, the Army had a pre-existing network of operatives deeply embedded in the target environment. The Slum Sisters and other officers were not outside observers, they were residents. They knew the intricate hierarchies of the streets, the subtle codes of communication, and the shifting alliances of the lodging houses. Bramwell Booth was tasked with mobilizing this network, not for its usual purpose of evangelism and charity, but for discreet surveillance. The instructions were precise. They were not to ask direct questions, which would be both dangerous and counterproductive. Instead, they were to listen. They were to document the ambient conversations in public houses, laundries, and street markets, the ordinary channels through which the community's secrets flowed. This passive intelligence gathering began to yield a consistent pattern. Certain names and locations recurred with notable frequency. The investigator started to identify specific individuals, almost exclusively women, who were known as procurers SES, or known as procurers SS, or, in the euphemistic slang of the time, as women who could get you anything you wanted. These were not the flamboyant, easily identifiable madams of popular fiction. On the contrary, their effectiveness lay in their apparent respectability. They were often midwives, laundresses, or keepers of small shops, women whose legitimate professions gave them a pretext to enter the homes of the poor, assess the family's level of desperation, and identify suitable children. They were rusted figures who exploited their trust for profit. The committee began to compile dossiers on these key operatives, creating a social and geographical map of the network. They charted the locations of specific brothels that were whispered to have a specialization in virgins. They noted the public houses where transactions were said to be initiated. They documented the nomenclature of the trade, the coded language used to discuss prices and goods. What emerged was not a centralized criminal empire, but a decentralized, opportunistic network of independent contractors linked by mutual interest. The procurers SES acted as brokers, connecting the desperate supply of the East End with the discreet demand from the West End. Through this methodical process of intelligence analysis, the committee identified several potential intermediaries who could be approached. However, they quickly realized that simply engaging a known procurer's and asking her to procure a child for them was fraught with risk. She might take their money and vanish, or worse, report their strange request to the authorities, exposing the entire scheme. They needed someone who was not just a participant in the trade, but who could be persuaded to switch her agents. They needed an insider who was disillusioned, vulnerable, or susceptible to an appeal to a long-dormant conscience. The success of the operation hinged on the recruitment of a specific type of operative, an individual who was not merely familiar with the trade but was, in fact, a product of it. The search for this crucial link intensified. The Salvation Army's network was again utilized, this time to identify women who had a history as procurers SES or brothel keepers, but who had since fallen on hard times or expressed a desire to escape their former lives. It was a delicate and dangerous search, requiring operatives to build trust in a world where trust was a fatal liability. After several weeks of careful reconnaissance and tentative approaches, a name surfaced that seemed to meet their unique and paradoxical requirements. She was a woman known to have deep, first-hand experience in the procurement of young girls for brothels, both in London and on the continent. She was also a woman whose life had taken a downward turn, leaving her in a precarious position. She knew the players, the language, and the methods. She was the key they had been searching for, the poacher who, they hoped, could be convinced to turn gamekeeper. The individual who emerged from the Salvation Army's discreet search was a woman named Rebecca Jarrett. She was, in every respect, the paradoxical figure the committee had been seeking, a product of the very system they sought to destroy, and therefore uniquely qualified to assist in its dismantling. Her life story was a grim testament to the cycles of poverty and exploitation that characterized the Victorian underworld. To understand her pivotal role in the events that followed, one must first understand the life that had prepared her for it. Jarrett was not an innocent drawn into a criminal conspiracy. She was a veteran of the trade, and her recruitment was a complex transaction rooted in desperation and a fragile hope for redemption. Born into poverty, Jarrett had been drawn into prostitution at a young age. Through a combination of resilience and acumen, she had navigated the brutal hierarchy of the vice trade, eventually graduating from a street worker to a brothel keeper herself. Her experience was not confined to London. She had operated in the network that trafficked English girls to the brothels of Brussels, giving her an intimate understanding of both the domestic and international dimensions of the trade. She knew the procurers' SES, the corrupt officials, and the methods of coercion and deception that sustained the entire enterprise. Her knowledge was not theoretical, it was earned through years of direct participation. By 1885, however, Jarrett's circumstances had changed. A series of personal and financial misfortunes had led to her downfall within the underworld. She had lost her establishment and had fallen back into a life of poverty and alcoholism. It was in this state of destitution that she came into the orbit of the Salvation Army. The Slum Sisters found her in one of their shelters, a woman haunted by her past and with no apparent future. The approach made to her by Bramwell Booth's operatives was not a simple financial proposition, but a carefully orchestrated appeal that targeted her vulnerability and her latent desire for a different life. They offered her not just money, but a path to what they termed salvation, a chance to atone for her past by helping to save others from a similar fate. The socio-economic calculus of her decision was undeniable. The committee offered her safety, accommodation, and a modest stipend, a significant improvement on her precarious existence. But her motivations, as she would later testify, were more complex. She expressed a profound weariness with her former life and a genuine, if conflicted, desire to do something good. She was, in essence, being offered a role that leveraged her unique and sordid expertise for a moral purpose. The sins of her past had become her greatest asset to the cause of reform. Once recruited, Rebecca Jarrett's value to the operation was threefold. First, she was a source of immediate credible intelligence. She could vet the committee's existing information, confirming which procurers' SES were still active and which brothels catered to the specific clientele they were targeting. She could dismiss false leads and guide the investigation with an insider's efficiency. Second, she was a guide and a trainer. She could instruct the committee's chosen operatives on how to act, what to say, and how to navigate the coded social interactions of the underworld. An uninitiated reformer would be spotted as an outsider in moments. Jarrett could provide the crucial veneer of authenticity. Third, and most crucially, she agreed to be the primary point of contact, the active participant who would shield the other investigators. W.T. Stead could not walk into a slum and negotiate for a child. Instead, Jarrett would be the one to approach the procuress, claiming she was acting on behalf of a wealthy client. This arrangement provided a vital layer of insulation. Jarrett's established identity as a former brothel keeper made her request plausible. She was the operation's shield of verisimilitude. The committee was thus placed in the morally ambiguous position of relying upon a sinner to catch sinners. They were using a woman whose life had been dedicated to the exploitation of the young to stage a controlled act of exploitation. They were, in a very real sense, asking her to return to a world she was trying to escape, to re-inhabit a persona she was trying to shed. The risk to Jarrett herself was immense. If her true purpose were discovered by her former associates, the repercussions would have been swift and brutal. But she agreed. With her recruitment, the committee now possessed the key to unlock the underworld's doors from the inside. The time for theoretical planning and passive intelligence gathering was over. The operational phase was about to begin. The time to select a child had come. With their primary operative in place, the committee's investigation moved from the strategic realm into the tactical. The operation now required a subject to living, breathing child who fit the precise parameters of their grim experiment. This selection process was not random. It was a calculated and methodical search for a specific demographic profile, one that would make the subsequent transaction as plausible and representative as possible. The task was to find, within the vast, anonymous poverty of London, a single family and a single child who could serve as the symbol for 1,000 unrecorded tragedies. The criteria were established with a cold, clinical precision. The child had to be a girl aged 13. This specific age was legally and symbolically crucial. A 13-year-old was, under the 1875 law, of the age of consent, meaning the act of procuring her would not, in itself, constitute statutory rape. This legal nuance was central to Stead's thesis that the law itself provided a shield for predators. Living in circumstances of such desperation that the offer of a small sum of money in exchange for their daughter's apprenticeship would appear not as a monstrous proposition, but as a potential, if only, the family, and particularly the mother, needed to possess a certain character, a degree of naivety, a lack of social connection, or a perceived moral weakness that would make them susceptible to the deceptions of a practiced procuress. The search was delegated primarily to Jarrett, guided by the on-the-ground intelligence of the Salvation Army. Jarrett was not looking for a victim in the abstract. She was applying her professional experience to identify a viable target. She began her search in the slums of Marylebone, an area she knew well from her previous life. She reactivated old networks, not as a procurer, but as a listener. Gathering the ambient gossip of the tenements and public houses, she knew what to look for: the families struggling with debt, the mothers known to drink, the children who ran the streets with minimal supervision. Her search soon led her to a family named Armstrong. They resided in a single room at 37 Charles Street, a location that placed them squarely within the socio-economic profile the committee had defined. The head of the family, Charles Armstrong, was a chimney sweep, a physically demanding and poorly paid profession that provided only a precarious income. His wife, Elizabeth, was responsible for raising their children in conditions of extreme poverty. Their existence a day-to-day struggle for survival. They represented, in every respect, the vulnerable demographic from which the victims of this trade were typically drawn. Within this family, there was a daughter, Eliza. She was 13 years old, a quiet and reportedly unremarkable girl. Crucially, from the committee's operational perspective, her mother, Elizabeth Armstrong, had a reputation in the neighborhood. She was known to be fond of gin and was perceived by her neighbors as disorganized and perhaps not the most in perhaps. This detail, however unflattering, was a vital piece of operational intelligence. To the investigators, Elizabeth Armstrong's perceived character flaws represented a vulnerability that could be exploited. They reasoned that a woman struggling with alcoholism and poverty would be more likely to believe the story they intended to present, and more likely to accept the small sum of money they intended to offer, without asking too many difficult questions. After several days of discreet observation and inquiry, Jarrett relayed her findings to the committee. The Armstrong family, and specifically Eliza, met all the necessary criteria. The location was correct. The family's poverty was undeniable. The daughter was the correct age, and the mother possessed the specific vulnerabilities that the sting operation required for success. A formal decision was made. Eliza Armstrong would be the subject. Her name, hitherto unknown outside impoverished circle, was, in effect, entered into a different kind of record, the committee's operational ledger. She ceased to be just a child and became a case file, the central component in a meticulously planned demonstration. The human variable for Stead's great social experiment had been identified and approved. The operational plan now hinged on a single, critical performance. Rebecca Jarrett, drawing upon years of experience in the art of persuasion and deceit, prepared to make her approach to the Armstrong household. She was not acting as a representative of the Salvation Army or a committee of high-minded reformers. She was re-inhabiting the persona of a procuress, a role she understood with chilling intimacy. Her cover story was meticulously crafted to be both alluring and plausible to a woman in Eliza Armstrong's position. She would not present herself as a buyer of children, but as a benevolent agent, acting on behalf of a wealthy, respectable lady seeking a young girl for domestic service. Jarrett's physical approach to 37 Charles Street was itself a part of the deception. She dressed the part not of a wealthy woman, which would have aroused suspicion, but of a respectable, working-class housekeeper or a minor functionary, someone who could move between the worlds of service and poverty without seeming out of place. When she met Elizabeth Armstrong, she presented a narrative designed to appeal directly to a mother's hopes and a pauper's desperation. She spoke of a position in a fine house, perhaps in Street John's Wood, a world away from the soot and grime of Marylebone. The work, she explained, would be light assisting a lady's maid, perhaps, or dusting ornaments. The girl would be well fed, well housed, and most importantly, would learn the skills necessary for a respectable life in service, an opportunity to escape the grinding poverty into which she was born. Elizabeth Armstrong's reaction, according to the records kept by the committee, was a mixture of suspicion and weary interest. The offer seemed too good to be true. Jarrett, anticipating this skepticism, skillfully managed the conversation. She spoke with a world-weary empathy, acknowledging the hardships of Mrs. Armstrong's life. She framed the proposition not as a favor to her employer, but as a genuine opportunity for Eliza. The subtext was clear: this was a chance to save one child from the fate that awaited them all in the slums. It was at this point that the conversation pivoted to the matter of money. This was the most delicate and crucial phase of the deception. Jarrett did not speak of a price for the girl. Such language would have been too crude and would likely have triggered an alarm, no matter the mother's desperation. Instead, she framed the financial component as a gesture of goodwill from the prospective employer. The lady, she explained, understood that to prepare a girl for a new position required some outlay. Eliza would need new clothes, better shoes, items the Armstrongs could not possibly afford. Therefore, the lady was prepared to offer an advance, a sum to be given directly to the mother to cover these expenses and to compensate her for the loss of any small income the child might have contributed to the family. The sum Jarrett mentioned was £5. To place this figure in its 1885 context is to understand its power. For a chimney sweep like Charles Armstrong, this could represent more than a month's wages. It was a sum capable of paying off debts, putting food on the table for weeks, and providing a buffer against the constant threat of destitution. It was not a trivial amount, it was a transformative one. The production of the actual banknotes, crisp and authoritative, would have had a profound psychological impact, making the abstract promise of a better future for Eliza tangible in the present moment for her mother. Faced with this proposition, a better life-altering sum of money for the rest of her family, Elizabeth Armstrong's resistance crumbled. Her parental anxieties were overridden by the crushing, immediate reality of her poverty. She questioned Jarrett further about the details of the position, and Jarrett provided plausible, reassuring answers. The decision was not made in a moment of pure cynical transaction, but through a process of rationalization born of extreme need. Armstrong gave her consent. She agreed that Jarrett could return at a stipulated time to collect Eliza. The £5 deception had been successful. The verbal contract, based entirely on a foundation of lies, was sealed. The committee now had what it needed: a mother's acquiescence, secured for a price, to hand her child over to a stranger. The stage was set for the next act, the physical transfer of ownership. The appointed time arrived with the grim punctuality of a debt collector. Rebecca Jarrett returned to the single room at 37 Charles Street not as a negotiator, but as an agent of transfer. The preliminary discussion was concluded. All that remained was the execution of the contract. The atmosphere in the room was thick with a tension born of unspoken truths and desperate rationalizations. This was the moment where a hypothetical escape from poverty became a concrete and irreversible act of maternal surrender. For Rebecca Jarrett, it was a professional engagement, a piece of theatre she had performed countless times before, albeit this time with a different director and a vastly different ultimate purpose. The centerpiece of this transaction was the money itself. The £5 were not transferred discreetly. According to the accounts constructed from the committee's records, the sum was presented in a deliberate, almost formal manner. It likely consisted of 5 single-pound notes, issued by the Bank of England, perhaps worn and folded, each one representing a unit of value almost abstract in its magnitude to the Armstrong family. Jarrett would have counted them out onto the rough wooden table, the sound of the paper a stark counterpoint to the strained silence of the room. This act of counting was not merely for verification, it was a ritual of exchange, the final affirmation that what was about to happen was a legitimate, albeit wretched, form of commerce. From an economic perspective, the £5 represented the brutal intersection of two vastly different worlds. To the imagined client, the wealthy West End gentleman from W.T. Stead was impersonating by proxy, this sum was trivial. It was the price of a fine dinner, a new pair of boots, or a night at the theatre. It was disposable income, spent on a fleeting and forbidden curiosity. For the Armstrongs, however, this same sum was a bulwark against catastrophe. It was rent paid for months in advance. It was food in the larder, shoes for the other children, a reprieve from the daily, gnawing anxiety of imminent starvation or the workhouse. This immense disparity in perceived value is what made the transaction possible. The system of exploitation was lubricated by the fact that a child's entire future could be purchased for a sum that its purchaser would barely notice was gone. Eliza Armstrong herself was a passive figure in this drama. At 13, she was old enough to sense the gravity of the moment, but likely too young and too sheltered from the world's true depravity to comprehend its real nature. She was an object of negotiation, a living commodity, whose fate was being decided. She would have been told to put on her best, threadbare dress, her few belongings gathered into a small, pathetic bundle. The instructions from her mother would have been practical: to be a good girl, to do as she was told, to listen to Mrs. Jarrett. These were the mundane platitudes of a parent ending a child off to her first job, a linguistic veil thrown over a far more sinister reality. The symbolic climax of the scene was the physical handover. After the money was accepted by Elizabeth Armstrong, her hand likely closing over the notes with a final, convulsive grip, the moment of transfer arrived. This was the point of no return. Rebecca Jarrett would have extended her hand, not to the mother, but to the child. The transfer of custody was complete when Elizabeth Armstrong released her daughter's hand, allowing Jarrett to take it. This simple physical gesture was freighted with immense significance. It was the severing of a parental bond and the establishment of a new commercial ownership. Eliza was no longer the daughter of Elizabeth Armstrong in the functional sense. She was now a ward, a charge, a piece of property belonging to the anonymous client Jarrett represented. Jarrett, for her part, would have conducted herself with a brisk, unemotional efficiency. Her role was to ensure the transfer was smooth, to prevent any last-minute changes of heart. Once the money was paid and the child was in her grasp, she would have moved to leave quickly. Lingering would only invite questions or emotional displays that could complicate the operation. She led Eliza Armstrong out of the single room, away from her family and her own world, and into the anonymous, fog-shrouded streets of London. The price of a child had been paid. The transfer of ownership was recorded. Eliza Armstrong was now, for all intents and purposes, an asset that had been acquired by the committee, a piece of evidence to be catalogued, verified, and ultimately presented to a horrified nation. Once Eliza Armstrong was clear of 37 Charles Street, her connection to her former life was severed not gradually, but with the sharp finality of a closing door. The journey that followed was likely her first experience in a hansom cab, a vehicle that would have transported her through streets and districts of London she had never seen. For a child whose entire existence had been circumscribed by a few blocks of impoverished Marylebone, the experience would have been profoundly disorienting. The purpose of this journey was not to comfort or acclimate her, but to transport her to the next station in the committee's carefully orchestrated experiment. The destination was not a home or a place of service, but a location where the condition of the recently acquired asset could be officially and clinically verified. The committee understood that their entire case rested on a chain of verifiable evidence. They needed to prove not only that a child could be purchased, but that the specific product promised by the vice-trade of Virgin could be reliably procured. Furthermore, and this was a critical component of their legal strategy, they needed to establish a baseline. They anticipated that when the story broke, their enemies would immediately accuse them of being the ones who had assaulted the child. They required a medical certificate, an expert testament to Eliza's physical state at the moment she entered their full custody. This document would serve as both a shield against future accusations and a sword to prove the authenticity of the transaction. The cab arrived at a private nursing home, likely one known to the committee's solicitor as being discreet and professional. Here, Eliza was handed over to a Frenchwoman, a certified midwife named Mademoiselle. The choice of a female examiner was a deliberate, if minor, concession to propriety. The setting was designed to be clinical and detached, devoid of the sordid atmosphere of a back alley clinic. This was to be a scientific assessment, not a prurient inspection. Was led into an examination room. She would have understood nothing of the purpose of this visit, only that she was being subjected to a series of instructions from strangers in an unfamiliar environment. The procedure itself was conducted with a cold medical professionalism that was, in its own way, as dehumanizing as any overt act of cruelty. Madame Morsey was not an accomplice in the moral sense. She was a contractor, hired to perform a specific medical assessment and provide a written report of her findings. For her, this was a routine, if perhaps unusual, request. She conducted a physical inspection, the sole objective of which was to ascertain the anatomical evidence of Eliza's virginity. This was the grim nadir of the entire operation. A child, purchased for £5, was now being physically examined to certify her value as a commodity, to confirm that the goods delivered were as advertised. The result of the examination was positive. Madame Morsey concluded that Eliza was, in the medical and legal terminology of the time, Virgo intacte. But a verbal confirmation was insufficient for Stead's purposes. He required a tangible piece of evidence. Madame Morsey, for an additional fee, prepared a formal certificate. This document, written on professional letterhead, dated and signed, stated her medical opinion in clear, unambiguous terms. It was a piece of paper that transformed the child's physical body into a legal fact, a data point in an investigative report. This certificate was the ultimate prize from this stage of the operation. It was forensic proof, a preemptive rebuttal to the inevitable slanders that would be hurled at the investigators. It proved that any harm that befell Eliza could not be attributed to them. Once the examination was complete and the certificate secured, Eliza was told to dress. Her role in this particular scene was over. She had been processed, catalogued, and certified. The committee now possessed a signed testament from a medical professional confirming the purity of the child they had bought from her mother just hours before. This document was immediately placed in a secure location, ready to be deployed when the public firestorm began. The ordeal was simply another inexplicable and frightening chapter in a day that had detached her from all reality. She was led out of the nursing home and back into the custody of the committee's agents. The next destination had already been prepared, a place that would simulate the authentic endpoint of the journey she had been saved from, the final piece of evidence required for Stead's devastating expose. The certification from Madame Morsey marked the completion of one critical phase of the operation. But the evidentiary chain was not yet whole. W.T. Stead's objective was not merely to prove that a child could be bought and medically certified. He needed to demonstrate that the entire commercial pathway, from procurement to delivery at a house of ill repute, was fully functional. To make his expose unassailable, he had to show that the system worked precisely as its customers expected it to. This required one final, morally treacherous act of simulation: the delivery of Eliza Armstrong to a brothel and her presentation to the client. For this purpose, the committee had secured a controlled location. It was a room in a house on Poland Street, Soho, an area already synonymous with London's more libertine nightlife. This was not a random choice. The location had to be authentic enough to be believable, yet the situation had to be completely managed by the committee's operatives to ensure Eliza's safety. Rebecca Jarrett, leveraging her extensive network of contacts, had likely made an arrangement with the house's madam For a substantial fee and the assurance of anonymity, a room was made available, and the madam agreed to play her part in the charade. She was a temporary, paid actor in the committee's grim theatre. Eliza was transported from the nursing home to this new address. To her, it was simply another stage in a bewildering and frightening journey. She was escorted into the house and taken to a private room. The room itself was likely furnished in a style of faded opulence, a stark contrast to the bare poverty of her home, yet possessing its own distinct atmosphere of sordidness and transience. Here, she was placed under the care of the collaborating madam, who had been given a strict protocol to follow. Eliza was instructed to wait quietly. A gentleman, she was told, would be arriving to see her. This waiting period was a calculated part of the simulation. In a real transaction, the child would be prepared and held until the client arrived. The committee was replicating this process to the letter. From a psychological standpoint, this was perhaps the most damaging part of the ordeal for Eliza, immersing her in the authentic dread and uncertainty of a victim awaiting her abuser within the house. But out of Eliza's sight, other operatives from the committee were stationed. A trusted female member of the Salvation Army was on standby, ready to intervene at a moment's notice. The entire environment was a carefully constructed stage, with Eliza as the unwitting centerpiece. The role of the client, the final participant in this simulation, was played by W.T. Stead himself. At the pre-arranged time, he arrived at the Portland Street address. He was admitted by the madam, completing the outward appearance of a standard commercial transaction. He was then led to the room where Eliza was waiting. This was the evidentiary climax of the entire operation. The moment Stead crossed the threshold and saw the 13-year-old girl waiting for him, the circuit was complete. Purchased from her mother for £5, her virginity medically certified, had now been successfully delivered to a brothel and presented to the end user. He had his proof. His interaction with Eliza was, by all accounts, brief and minimal. He did not touch her. He may have spoken a few words to her, his tone likely doing little to calm her fear, given the context. His primary purpose was not to interact with her, but to bear witness to the final tableau. He was there as the journalist, the investigator, the prosecutor, observing the scene that he himself had engineered. Having confirmed that the final link in the chain was in place, he turned and left the room. His departure was the signal. The moment he was clear of the room, the waiting Salvation Army officer entered. The simulation was over. The operative's role was to immediately remove Eliza from the environment, to provide her with a measure of comfort, and to begin the process of moving her to a place of genuine safety. Eliza Armstrong's role as a piece of living evidence was concluded. She had been passed through every station of the trade, from the poverty of her home to the clinical detachment of the examination room, and finally to the feigned opulence of a brothel. The committee now possessed a complete, first-hand, and irrefutable narrative. They had not just investigated the trade, they had replicated it. The story was now ready to be written. But first, its primary subject had to be made to disappear. The conclusion of the simulated transaction at the Portland Street address triggered the immediate and final phase of the committee's duty of care towards their subject. Eliza Armstrong, having served her purpose as a piece of living evidence, now represented a significant liability. The moment W.T. Stead's articles were published, her identity would become the single most volatile element of the entire affair. She would be sought by rival journalists eager to discredit the story, by the police investigating the technical crime of abduction, and potentially by agents of the powerful men whose interests Stead's campaign threatened. To allow her to remain in London, or even in England, was to risk the immediate collapse of the entire enterprise. The committee's strategy, therefore, dictated that the primary evidence must be secured by being removed from the jurisdiction. The operation to transport Eliza was executed with the same clandestine precision as her procurement. Her new custodian was a trusted female officer of the Salvation Army, a woman chosen for her discretion and her ability to manage a traumatized and bewildered child. Eliza was moved from the house in Soho under the cover of darkness, bundled into a closed carriage, and taken not to a closed carriage, and taken not to a home but to a temporary safe house on the outskirts of London. Here, She was given a change of clothes on the outskirts of London, her first respite after a day of profound psychological dislocation. Communication with her was kept to a minimum. Any detailed explanation of the situation would have been both incomprehensible to her and a security risk. She was simply a passenger, moved by forces she could not understand. The ultimate destination had been decided upon in advance. France. This choice was strategic. The English Channel provided a physical and, more importantly, a legal barrier. A child in a Salvation Army home in Paris was far beyond the reach of a London constable's warrant or Fleet Street reporter's inquiries. The logistics of the journey were planned to attract minimal attention. Traveling under the guise of a Salvation Army officer accompanying a young charge to a continental mission was a plausible cover story. They would have traveled by rail to a port city, likely Dover, before taking a public ferry across the Channel to Calais. For Eliza, this journey would have been a series of overwhelming, undalien sensory experiences. A child who had likely never traveled more than a few miles on foot in her life was now being transported by steam train and steamship. The sight of the open sea, the noise of the ship's engine, the sound of a foreign language being spoken around her in Calais all would have contributed to a state of profound disorientation. She was not a tourist or a traveler. She was a parcel being shipped to a secure holding facility. Her guardian's role was to ensure her compliance and to deflect any unwanted curiosity from fellow passengers or officials. Upon their arrival in France, they did not linger in the port. They proceeded directly to Paris, where the Salvation Army maintained a presence. Eliza was installed in a rescue home, an institution designed for fallen women and vulnerable girls. Here, she was placed under the care of French-speaking Salvationists, who were likely given only the barest details of her case, instructed simply that she was a special charge from London who required absolute security and was to have no contact with the outside world. She was, in effect, a prisoner for her own protection. Her name was changed and she was absorbed into the institutional routine of the home. From the committee's perspective, this successful exfiltration was a major victory. With Eliza secured abroad, they controlled the narrative's most crucial variable. She could not be questioned, interviewed, or manipulated. Her physical absence created a vacuum that only Stead's version of the story could fill. She became a symbol in absentia, her story told on her behalf by the very men who had engineered her disappearance. The committee could now proceed with the publication of their expose with the knowledge that their key witness was safe and, more importantly, silent. The stage was now cleared of its main actor. The house lights were about to come up on the public performance, and the entire nation was the designated audience. The first print run of the Pall Mall Gazette containing the explosive first installment was being prepared. On Monday, July 6, 1885, the vendors of the Pall Mall Gazette began to hawk an evening edition that would detonate in the heart of London society. There was no subtle introduction to the subject matter. The front page was stark, dominated by a single, arresting headline, "The Maiden Tribute of Modern Babylon." Below it, a note from the editor W.T. Stead offered a solemn and calculated warning. He advised any reader who was squeamish, or who preferred to live in a fool's paradise to leave the paper and read. He further recommended that heads of households might not wish for the women and children of their family to peruse its contents. This preamble was not merely a gesture of Victorian propriety, it was a masterful piece of marketing, a clear signal that the material contained within was transgressive, essential, undoubtedly explosive. The article itself, the first of a planned series, was a masterclass in Stead's new journalism. It was not presented as a typical news report, but as the findings of a secret commission of inquiry. This framing lent an immediate and quasi-official authority to the text. Stead did not begin with statistics or abstract arguments. He began with a story. It was the narrative of a 13-year-old girl, whom he gave the pseudonym Lily, a name chosen to evoke innocence and fragility. Often melodramatic prose, he recounted the entire process that the committee had just engineered. He described the initial approach to the mother, the negotiation, and the payment of the £5 that secured her consent. He chronicled the girl's removal from her home, her journey across London, and the cold, clinical medical examination that certified her virginity. The narrative culminated in the chilling tableau at the house of ill repute, where Lily was delivered and presented to her purchaser. Stead's writing was a potent combination of factual reporting and moralistic, almost biblical condemnation. He invoked the myth of the Minotaur, the beast of Crete that devoured the annual tribute of Athenian youths and maidens, casting the wealthy, depraved men of London as a modern incarnation of this ancient monster. He described the system not as a series of isolated crimes, but as a highly organized, commercial enterprise, a slave trade operating in the heart of a supposedly Christian empire. While the names and specific locations were altered to protect his sources and himself from libel laws, the sequence of events was presented as an unimpeachable, first-hand account. He was not reporting on a rumor. He was publishing a field report from the heart of darkness. The immediate impact on the public was seismic. The initial print run of the Pall Mall Gazette sold out within hours. Crowds gathered outside the newspaper's offices on Northumberland Street, clamoring for copies. London was seized by a mixture of shock, morbid curiosity, and profound moral outrage. The story was the sole topic of conversation in the city's clubs, its drawing rooms, and its public houses. The abstract whispers that had for years circulated among reformers were now a concrete, detailed, and horrifying narrative printed in black and white for all to see. However, the reaction was not one of universal approbation. The establishment press, including powerful rivals like The Times, was largely condemnatory. They accused Stead of peddling filth and of engaging in a form of journalism that was indecent and morally corrupting. They argued that he was doing more harm than good by publicizing such depravities, potentially putting ideas into the heads of the impressionable. The powerful bookseller and newsagent W.H. Smith, a bastion of public morality, declared the edition obscene and refused to stock it at its ubiquitous railway station bookstalls, a move that could have crippled the paper's distribution. Stead, anticipating this, had organized his own army of street vendors who sold the paper directly to the public. Their cries of the Maiden tribute, echoing through the city. The battle lines were being drawn. The first article had not just told a story, it had thrown down a gauntlet, forcing a national reckoning that was only just beginning. The initial shockwave generated by the first article was only the precursor to a sustained societal earthquake. W.T. Stead did not allow the public's initial outrage to dissipate. Over the subsequent days, the Pall Mall Gazette continued its bombardment, publishing new installments of the Maiden tribute of modern Babylon. Each article explored a different facet of the trade, escalating the sense of pervasive corruption. One installment detailed the role of procurers, SES, and the mechanics of the trade. Another explored the international trafficking of English girls to continental brothels. A third hinted at the involvement of figures in the highest echelons of society, the so-called Minotaurs of London. The cumulative effect was to transform a single shocking story into an inescapable national crisis. The attempts by the establishment to suppress the paper backfired spectacularly, fueling a public perception of a high-level cover-up. W.H. Smith's refusal to stock the Gazette turned the act of buying and reading it into a minor form of civil disobedience. Stead's improvised network of street vendors was overwhelmed by demand. In cities and towns across the country, people who had never before read the London paper now sought it out. Copies were passed hand to hand, read aloud in working men's clubs, and debated furiously in letters to the editors of other, more conservative newspapers. The articles had breached the walls of the London media bubble and were now setting the national agenda. This widespread public agitation soon coalesced into organized action. Social reform groups, religious organizations, and nascent feminist movements seized upon the momentum created by Stead's articles. The Salvation Army, a key partner in the secret investigation, moved to the forefront of the public campaign. They, along with other nonconformist churches, organized public prayer meetings and rallies that were, in effect, political protests under the guise of religious revival. The language of the pulpit merged with the language of social reform, framing the campaign as a holy war for the soul of the nation. The movement reached its zenith in late July and early August. A massive demonstration was organized in Hyde Park, London. On August 22, 1885, A crowd estimated at over 250,000 people gathered to demand immediate legislative action. It was a remarkable cross-section of society. Working-class families marched, alongside middle-class reformers and members of the clergy. Banners bore slogans drawn directly from Stead's articles, demanding protection for the nation's daughters and calling for the passage of the long-stalled Criminal Law Amendment Bill. This was not a riotous mob. It was an organized, determined, and overwhelmingly peaceful expression of the public will, a powerful demonstration of the moral panic's ability to mobilize a mass movement. The campaign's moral authority was significantly enhanced by the public support of prominent religious leaders, which cut across the deep sectarian divides of Victorian England. The Archbishop of Canterbury, Edward Y. Benson, the head of the Anglican Church, publicly endorsed the need for reform. More surprisingly, Cardinal Henry Edward Manning, the leader of England's Roman Catholic community, also lent his powerful voice to the cause. This ecumenical alliance lent the campaign a gravitas that made it impossible for politicians to dismiss as the hysterical ravings of a single sensationalist editor. The Maiden tribute had created an atmosphere of intense social paranoia. The anonymous, shadowy Minotaur described in Stead's articles became a potent symbol of aristocratic depravity. A cloud of suspicion hung over the West End. Any wealthy, well-dressed gentleman could be imagined as a secret predator. This fear, while diffuse and often irrational, was a powerful social solvent, breaking down the traditional deference afforded to the upper classes. For a brief, intense period, the moral order of society seemed to be inverted. The supposed guardians of the nation's virtue were now its most suspected villains, and the once despised radical press had become its moral conscience. The daily publication of the articles acted as a constant stoking of this fire, ensuring that the pressure on the political establishment did not wane but grew with each passing day. The nation, now fully awakened, thoroughly scandalized, turned its collective, furious gaze towards Westminster. The immense pressure generated by the national outcry did not dissipate at the gates of Westminster. It breached them with overwhelming force, creating a political firestorm that consumed the agenda. For the members of Parliament, the situation had transformed from a distant, low-priority social issue into an urgent and unavoidable crisis. The daily spectacle of the Pall Mall Gazette's articles, coupled with the mass demonstrations and the deluge of petitions flooding their offices, made further inaction politically suicidal. The government of the day was uniquely vulnerable to such a tidal wave of public opinion. In June 1885, just a month before the articles began, William Gladstone's Liberal government had fallen, and a minority Conservative administration under Lord Salisbury had taken office as a caretaker government, pending a general election later in the year. This weak political position meant the government had neither the mandate nor the will to resist a popular movement of this magnitude. The primary focus of this political maelstrom was the Criminal Law Amendment Bill. Before Stead's crusade, this piece of legislation had been the very definition of a parliamentary afterthought. It had been introduced several times over the preceding years, only to be repeatedly shelved, filibustered, or lost in the labyrinthine procedural machinery of the House of Commons. Its core proposal to raise the age of consent from 13 to 16 faced a quiet but effective opposition from a bloc of MPs who considered it an unwarranted state interference in private morality, while many others were simply indifferent. Now, this obscure and neglected bill was suddenly the most important piece of legislation in the country. The Home Secretary, Sir Richard Cross, found himself at the epicenter of the storm. As the minister responsible for law and order, it fell to him to manage the government's response. A pragmatist, Cross recognized that the political calculus had been fundamentally altered. The government's survival, and indeed the personal political fortunes of every MP, now depended on being seen to act decisively. He moved with a speed that was, in the context of Victorian parliamentary procedure, breathtaking. The Criminal Law Amendment Bill was retrieved from its legislative limbo and placed at the very top of the parliamentary schedule. The debates in the House of Commons, which had previously been sparsely attended discussions on legal technicalities, were now packed and charged with a new moral urgency. Members who might have previously voiced objections were now cowed into silence by the force of public opinion. To speak against the bill was to risk being branded a sympathizer with the Minotaurs of London. The bill was rushed through its remaining stages in the Commons with almost no significant opposition. Amendments that might have weakened its provisions were swept aside. The government, far from resisting, now acted as the bill's most enthusiastic champion, eager to be seen as the agent of the nation's moral cleansing. Having passed the Commons with unprecedented celerity, the bill was sent to the House of Lords. Here, in the aristocratic upper chamber, it might have been expected to meet with more resistance. The Lords were insulated from direct public pressure and were notoriously conservative on matters of social change. However, even they could gnaw the political hurricane blowing outside their chamber. The endorsement of the campaign by the Archbishop of Canterbury and Cardinal Manning carried immense weight. Faced with a united front of public, press and church, the House of Lords capitulated. The bill passed through the upper house with the same remarkable speed it had passed through the Commons. On August 14, 1885, a little over a month after the first Maiden Tribute article appeared, the Criminal Law Amendment Act received royal assent and officially became law. Its primary provision raised the age of consent for girls from 13 to 16. It also strengthened the laws against brothel keeping, granted police greater powers to investigate and suppress the vice trade, and made it illegal to procure a girl under the age of 18 for immoral purposes. It was a total and astonishing victory for W.T. Stead and his collaborators. They had, through a high-risk media campaign, achieved in 5 weeks what years of conventional lobbying had failed to do. The political objective had been met. However, the weapon Stead had deployed was about to recoil upon its creator. The very narrative that had secured his victory was beginning to unravel at its source, as the identity of his symbolic victim, Lily, started to emerge from the shadows. While the legislative victory was being celebrated in the reformist press and the pulpits of the nation, the human centerpiece of the entire campaign remained sequestered in a Salvation Army home in Paris. The anonymity granted to her by the pseudonym Lily was a critical component of the committee's strategy, allowing her to function as a powerful, universal symbol of exploited innocence. This anonymity, however, was a fragile shield. With the entire London press desperate for a new angle, the identity of the real girl at the center of the Maiden Tribute was the most valuable secret in the city. And it was a secret that could not be kept indefinitely. The breach came not from a high-level leak within the committee, but from the ground up within the tightly packed, insular community of Marylebone. The disappearance of a local child, Eliza Armstrong, from 37 Charles Street, was a known event in her immediate neighborhood. When the Pall Mall Gazette published its detailed account of the procurement of a 13-year-old girl from a poor family in that very district, local residents began to connect the dots. The ambient gossip of the tenements and public houses quickly coalesced into a firm rumor: Lily was Eliza Armstrong. This rumor was journalistic gold. Rival newspapers, which had been cast in the unflattering role of either ignoring the story or condemning Stead for his methods, were eager to find a weakness in his narrative. They deployed reporters to Marylebone, not to investigate the systemic issues Stead had raised, but to hunt for the specific individuals involved in his sting operation. It did not take them long to confirm what the local gossip was already suggesting. By interviewing neighbors and, eventually, by locating and confronting the Armstrong family themselves, the press shattered the pseudonym. Lily was publicly and irrevocably identified as Eliza Armstrong. This revelation fundamentally and permanently altered the nature of the public discourse. The symbol was thus rendered into flesh and blood. The abstract victim, who could represent every vulnerable child in the nation, had become a concrete individual with a name, a family, and a specific, squalid address. This had two immediate and devastating consequences. First, it shifted the focus of public and media attention away from the Minotaurs, the wealthy, anonymous abusers, and onto the Armstrong family, their poverty, their perceived moral failings, and the character of Elizabeth Armstrong were now subjects of intense national scrutiny. They were transformed from a representative case study into the central actors in a squalid domestic drama. Second, Eliza herself was transformed from an archetype into a celebrity of the most wretched kind. Though she was physically absent in France, her name and her story were now public property. Her face, likely described from neighbors' memories, was imagined in thousands of households. The intimate details of her life, her family's poverty, and the circumstances of her sale were dissected in the pages of newspapers that now saw a commercial opportunity in the human interest side of the scandal. She was no longer a symbol of a cause, she was a spectacle. For the Armstrongs, the consequences were catastrophic. Their single room at 37 Charles Street became an unwilling landmark, a destination for the curious and the judgmental. They were subjected to an unceasing barrage of questions from reporters, police investigators, and concerned citizens. Elizabeth Armstrong, in particular, was cast into the center of a moral firestorm. Portrayed alternately, was a tragic victim of poverty and as an unnatural mother who had sold her own child. The £5 she had received, a sum that represented a desperate choice in her private life, was now a matter of public record and condemnation. For Eliza, the revelation meant that her sanctuary in Paris was now a gilded cage. Her anonymity, the primary shield provided by her protectors, had been shattered. The story was no longer about a generic Lily who could be quietly reintegrated into society later. It was now about Eliza Armstrong, a gal whose name was inextricably linked to a National Voice scandal. Paradoxically, the public's knowledge of her identity made her return to England even more perilous. She was now a marked individual, the living evidence in a case that was rapidly shifting from a moral crusade into a criminal investigation. She was a victim not only of the social conditions that had made her vulnerable, but also of the very public spectacle that had been orchestrated in the name of her rescue. The human cost of Stead's methods was beginning to be calculated, and the first entry in the ledger was the stolen privacy and compromised future of Eliza Armstrong. With her daughter's identity now public knowledge, Elizabeth Armstrong was transformed from an anonymous background figure into the epicenter of the scandal's second act. She was no longer a case study in a sociological report, but a woman besieged, her life and her decisions subjected to an unbearable level of public scrutiny. Initially, her position was one of confusion and defensive silence. She had, in her own mind, agreed to a transaction she believed would lead to a better life for her child. The public revelation that Eliza had been taken not to a place of service but to a brothel, even a simulated one, would have struck her with genuine maternal horror and a profound sense of betrayal. She was, in a very real sense, a victim of a complex and high-minded deception. This personal sense of grievance, however, was soon instrumentalized by the powerful forces that were mobilizing against W.T. Stead. The first of these were the police. Scotland Yard, having been publicly shamed by the Gazette's articles for its inaction, was now under immense pressure to investigate the matter. The most direct and obvious crime was not the systemic vice that Stead had exposed, but the specific, documented act of abduction that he himself had orchestrated. Detectives from the Criminal Investigation Department began to interview the Armstrongs. Their line of questioning would have been stark and accusatory. From a legal standpoint, Elizabeth Armstrong was not a victim but a potential accomplice. She had accepted money in exchange for her child. The investigators would have made it clear that her own legal position was precarious, and that her best, perhaps only, path to avoiding prosecution was to portray herself as a wholly innocent party who had been cruelly deceived. Simultaneously, the journalistic enemies of Stead descended upon the Armstrong family. Reporters from rival newspapers, eager to discredit the new journalism and its moralistic editor, saw Elizabeth Armstrong as their key witness. Unlike Stead's committee, which had approached her with a complex, high-minded deception, these journalists likely approached her with a simpler proposition: sympathy, support, and financial inducement in exchange for her story. They would have listened patiently to her account, emphasizing the elements of deception and kidnapping while downplaying her initial complicity. They provided her with a new narrative, one that recast her not as a desperate, flawed mother making a questionable choice, but as the grieving victim of a criminal conspiracy perpetrated by a fanatic editor. Under this combined pressure of legal threat and sympathetic manipulation, Elizabeth Armstrong's story began to shift. The ambiguity of her initial consent was gradually erased, replaced by a clear and legally useful account. She now insisted, with increasing conviction, that she had been explicitly told Eliza was going into domestic service. She claimed she never would have let her daughter go, had she known the true nature of the arrangement. The £5. Previously a compelling factor in her decision was recontextuated as a simple advance in new clothes, its transactional nature minimized. Her muddled, desperate act of parental negotiation was refined and polished by police questioning on journalistic coaching into a simple, powerful story of abduction by trickery. This revised narrative was then formalized. Legal counsel, likely funded by Stead's political and journalistic opponents, was provided to the Armstrong family. On their advice, Elizabeth Armstrong swore out a formal, legal complaint. She provided a detailed, sworn statement to the police, attesting that her daughter, Eliza, had been taken from her without her true consent and against her will. The official charge was abduction. The primary targets of the complaint were W.T., the mastermind of the operation, and Rebecca Jarrett, the agent who had carried out the procurement. The complaint from the mother provided the police with the final piece of legal machinery they required. The matter was no longer a subject for public debate. It was now a criminal case. The state, which had been so slow to act on his crusade, was now poised to act with swift and decisive force against him. Stead the crusader was about to become Stead the accused. Elizabeth Armstrong's formal complaint acted as the percussion cap, and the state's legal machinery, now fully primed, discharged with an efficiency it had conspicuously lacked when confronted with the systemic abuse of children. The warrants were sworn and issued by a magistrate, transforming the key figures of the Maiden tribute campaign from celebrated social crusaders into fugitives from the law. The Metropolitan Police, stung by the implicit and explicit criticisms of their efficacy in Stead's articles, acted on these warrants with alacrity. The hunters had become the hunted. The arrest of William T. Stead was a moment of profound public drama, though its execution was a matter of mundane police procedure. He was not apprehended in a public square, but was taken into custody in a sober, almost anticlimactic fashion. A pair of detectives arrived at the offices of the Pall Mall Gazette on Northumberland Street, the very nerve centre from which the national moral panic had been directed. They presented the warrant, and Stead, by all accounts, surrendered without resistance. His reaction was not one of surprise or fear, but of a grim, theatrical acceptance. He had known from the outset that his radical methods placed him in extreme legal jeopardy. In his own mind, this arrest was not a defeat but a necessary, perhaps even welcome, martyrdom, the logical and ultimate proof of the establishment's corruption. The sweep was not limited to Stead. Warrants were executed for his principal collaborators. Bramwell Booth, the Chief of Staff of the Salvation Army, was also arrested. This was a significant escalation, as it brought the nation's most prominent evangelical organization directly into the criminal dock. The sight of a leader of the army, a movement dedicated to saving souls, being charged with a crime related to moral turpitude, was a shocking paradox that delighted Stead's enemies and dismayed his allies. The most poignant arrest was that of Rebecca Jarrett. She was the key operative, the poacher-turned-gamekeeper, whose insider knowledge had made the entire sting operation possible. For her, the arrival of the police was not a step towards martyrdom but a terrifying return to a world she had been promised she could escape. The very system of law and order that she had helped to expose was now turning its full, impersonal force upon her. She had been offered redemption and was now being handed a summons to court. Her testimony, which the committee had believed would be their sword, would now be a central exhibit in her own prosecution. The midwife, Mademoiselle, who had performed the clinical examination, was also arrested, her professional service now reclassified as a criminal act of assault. The charges were formally laid. The primary indictment was for the abduction of Eliza Armstrong. The prosecution's case, based on the mother's revised testimony, was simple. Stead and his agents had, by means of fraudulent misrepresentation, taken a child under the age of 14 out of the possession and against the will of her parent. A second, significant charge was added: indecent assault. This charge stemmed directly from the medical examination conducted by Mademoiselle. As Eliza was a minor, any such examination without true parental consent constituted a technical assault on her person. The irony was crushing and complete. Stead had set out to expose a vast network of men who bought and sexually abused children, yet he and his team were the only ones facing criminal prosecution. The Minotaurs of London remained anonymous and untouched, while the investigators who had laid the trap were now caught in a legal snare of their own making. The public reaction to the arrests was intensely polarized. To Stead's legions of supporters, this was the ultimate proof of a high-level conspiracy. It was the establishment protecting its own, using the letter of the law to crush a man who dared to reveal its rotten core. Rallies were held in his support, and a defense fund was established. To his detractors, however, the arrests were a vindication. They saw it as the necessary consequence of a reckless and immoral journalistic stunt. Stead, they argued, was no hero. He was a cynical manipulator who had broken the law, traumatized a child, and exploited a vulnerable family for the sake of selling newspapers. Stead, ever the master of public opinion, seized control of this new narrative. From his position as the accused, he used the Pall Mall Gazette as his personal defense organ. He declared that he welcomed the trial. The courtroom, he argued, would be a new and superior platform for his crusade. He was no longer just an editor, he was a defendant, and his trial would not be about the abduction of one girl, but about the systemic abduction of a generation of the poor. The journalist was now formally in the dock, preparing for a legal spectacle that promised to be the final, defining act of the entire Maiden Rebute affair. The venue was set for the nation's most famous tribunal, the Central Criminal Court, better known as the Old Bailey. The trial of W.T. Stead and his co-conspirators, which opened at the Old Bailey in October 1885, was the legal and theatrical culmination of the entire Maiden tribute scandal. It was not merely a criminal proceeding, it was a national event, a piece of public theatre that drew in crowds and dominated the headlines of every newspaper in the country. The courtroom itself became the arena where the two competing narratives of the affair would clash. On one side was the prosecution, representing the Crown, which sought to frame the case as a simple, sordid tale of child abduction and assault, orchestrated by a self-aggrandizing journalist. On the other was the defense, which aimed to elevate the proceedings into a trial of the nation's conscience, arguing that their clients' technical crimes were a necessary, even heroic, means to a greater moral end. The presiding judge, Mr. Justice Slopes, was a figure of the legal establishment, a man not known for his sympathies towards radical social reformers. The prosecution was led by the Attorney General himself, a clear indication of the seriousness with which the state viewed the case. Stead, characteristically, chose to represent himself for parts of the trial, a decision that allowed him to turn his testimony and cross-examinations into lengthy, sermonizing speeches. Effectively using the witness box as his own personal pulpit, he was not just a defendant, he was the master of ceremonies, attempting to direct the proceedings away from the dry facts of the law and towards the grand moral themes of his crusade. The prosecution's case was built, brick by methodical brick, on the testimony of Eliza Armstrong. In the witness box, she recounted the revised version of events that had been solidified during the police investigation. She portrayed herself as a trusting mother who had been cruelly deceived by Rebecca Jarrett. She insisted that she had believed her daughter was in a respectable position in domestic service and that she had never consented to her being taken for any immoral purpose. On the whole, a credible and sympathetic witness, her account of a mother's betrayal resonating with the jury's sense of familial propriety. The defense's primary challenge was Rebecca Jarrett. As the direct agent of the procurement, her testimony was critical. On the stand, she found herself in an impossible position. She was a woman caught between two worlds, her credibility assailed from both sides. The prosecution portrayed her as a degenerate procureuress, a fallen woman whose word could not be trusted. Stead's defense, meanwhile, relied on her to confirm the details of their operation, yet her very presence and history tainted their moral standing. Her attempts to explain the noble intentions behind the sting were undermined by her own sordid past, a past the prosecution took great pains to expose in lurid detail. She was the operation's most essential tool and, in the courtroom, its greatest liability. A pivotal moment in the trial was the testimony regarding the medical examination. The prosecution presented it as a clear-cut case of indecent assault. They argued that whatever the mother's initial consent might have entailed, it certainly did not extend to allowing a stranger to conduct an intimate physical inspection of her daughter. Madame Morsey's clinical certificate, which Stead had seen as his shield, was transformed by the prosecution into a weapon, a cold, documentary proof of the assault. Stead's defense was one of motive. He did not deny the basic facts of the case. He admitted to having arranged the procurement, the examination, and the delivery of the child to the Poland Street house. His entire argument rested on the claim that these actions, while technically illegal, were not performed with criminal intent mens rea. He argued that his sole purpose was to gather evidence to expose a great social evil and to save thousands of other children from a terrible fate. He contended, guilty of a good deed. He read excerpts from the Maiden Tribute articles into the court record, attempting to shift the trial's focus from the specific case of Eliza Armstrong to the general plight of London's children. The public gallery was packed for every day of the proceedings. Spectators queued for hours to gain entry, eager to witness the drama firsthand. The trial became a proxy battle for the soul of Victorian society. For Stead's supporters, it was a show trial, a vindictive prosecution by a corrupt establishment. For his detractors, it was a necessary reassertion of the rule of law against the dangerous excesses of a reckless sensationalist. As the trial progressed, however, it became clear that the legal system was not equipped to adjudicate a case on the basis of its moral intentions. The judge repeatedly steered the proceedings back to the hard, unyielding facts of the law. The central question was not whether Stead's cause was just, but whether his actions were legal. And on that narrow technical ground, the case against him was formidable. The jury retired to consider its verdict, bearing the weight of a nation's divided opinion. Their task, as instructed by Mr. Justice Slopes, was not to pass judgment on W.T. Stead's journalistic crusade or the moral state of London, but to apply the cold letter of the law to the specific facts presented in court. The legal questions were narrow and technical, stripped of the grand moral rhetoric that had characterized Stead's defense. Had a child been taken from her parent by means of a false pretense? Had that child been subjected to a physical examination without legally valid consent? The intentions of the defendants, the judge had made clear, were largely irrelevant to these questions of fact. When the jury returned, the clerk of the court read out the verdicts. On the most serious charge of abduction with the intent to defile, Stead and his collaborators were found not guilty. The jury accepted that their ultimate purpose was not the sexual exploitation of Eliza Armstrong. This was a partial, but significant, victory for the defense, an acknowledgement of their underlying moral purpose. However, this was immediately followed by the verdicts on the lesser, but still serious charges. On the charge of abduction, simply the act of taking the child without proper consent, W.T. Stead and Rebecca Jarrett were found guilty. The jury had accepted Elizabeth Armstrong's testimony that she had been deceived, and that her consent was therefore invalid. Bramwell Booth was acquitted of this charge, the jury likely believing he was one step removed from the direct conspiracy of the procurement. On the charge of indecent assault, stemming from the medical examination, Stead, Jarrett, and Madame Morsey were all found guilty. The court affirmed the prosecution's argument that the examination, conducted without the mother's informed consent, constituted a criminal violation of the child's person. The verdict was a complex and nuanced legal judgment that was immediately simplified in the public mind. Stead was guilty. The editor who had stood as the nation's prosecutor was now a convicted criminal. Before passing sentence, the judge addressed Stead directly, his words a formal rebuke from the legal establishment to the disruptive force of the new journalism. He acknowledged Stead's stated motives, conceding that he may have acted out of a genuine, if misguided, desire to do good. The judge was emphatic that the law could not, and would not, excuse criminal acts performed in the service of a cause, no matter how noble. To do so, he argued, would be to invite anarchy, to allow any individual who believed in the righteousness of their own mission to trample upon the rights of others and the laws of the land. He then passed sentence. For the crime of abduction, William T. Stead was sentenced to 3 months in prison. Rebecca Jarrett, whose role as the primary agent was seen as more direct, received a harsher sentence of 6 months. Madame Morsey, for her part in the assault, her sentences were relatively light for the offences, a tacit acknowledgement, perhaps, of the unusual circumstances of the case. But they were prison sentences nonetheless. The crusading editor was to be incarcerated in Holloway Gaol. The outcome was a perfect paradox. Stead had been found guilty of a good deed. His actions had directly led to the passage of a landmark piece of protective legislation, an achievement that would benefit generations of children. Yet, the very methods he had used to secure this victory had resulted in his own criminal conviction and imprisonment. The verdict was a stark affirmation of a fundamental legal principle: the ends do not justify the means. The law, in its majestic and sometimes infuriating impartiality, had refused to make an exception for him. For Stead, the sentence was the final jewel in his crown of martyrdom. He accepted it not with shame, but with a defiant pride. He was a political prisoner, a captive in a war against vice and corruption. He had forced the state to act, and now the state was taking its revenge. As he was led from the dock to begin his sentence, the two competing realities of his legacy were irrevocably fused. He was both a social hero and a convicted criminal, a moral victor and a legal failure. The system he had so effectively manipulated had, in the end, reasserted its own implacable logic. The transfer of William T. Stead from the dock of the Old Bailey to a cell in Holloway Gaol marked the physical culmination of his legal defeat. Yet, this very act of incarceration paradoxically served to solidify and sanctify. This the iron gates closed behind him. The law for which he had campaigned was already the law of the land, its ink barely dry on the statute books. His imprisonment thus became a strange and potent postscript to the legislative process, the final, sacrificial act that confirmed the necessity and righteousness of the reform he had forced into existence. He was a general watching the triumphant consolidation of his victory from a prison camp. Stead's status in prison reflected the ambivalence of the authorities towards his crime. He was not treated as a common felon but was classified as a first-class misdemeanant, a special category of prisoner that afforded him significant privileges. He was permitted to wear his own clothes, furnish his cell with a desk and books, and, most crucially, to receive correspondence and visitors. This lenient treatment effectively turned his cell into a remote editorial office. Stead continued to edit the Pall Mall Gazette. Couriers brought him page proofs and dispatches from his staff. He returned them with his handwritten corrections and editorial instructions. The paper's daily editions continued to bear his unmistakable imprint, his leaders and columns now carrying the added moral authority of having been written from a martyr's cell. This continued activity ensured that his cause did not fade from the public consciousness. His imprisonment became a running story, a daily reminder of the price he had paid to protect the nation's children. He was lionized by his supporters. Letters of thought poured in from across the country and the world. Prominent public figures, including members of the clergy and politicians who had initially been wary of his methods, now publicly praised his courage and the profound social good he had accomplished. His courage and his conviction, far from discrediting him, had elevated him into a figure of mere mythic status in the reformist community. The victory itself, the Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885, was a legislative landmark. Its central and most celebrated provision, the raising of the age of consent from 13 to 16, fundamentally redrew the legal boundaries of childhood and female sexuality. It was a direct and unambiguous repudiation of the legal framework that had enabled the Maiden tribute system to flourish. The act also armed the police with new and formidable powers. It increased the penalties for brothel keeping, made it a crime to harbor a girl under 18 for immoral purposes, and granted magistrates the power to issue search warrants for premises suspected of holding abducted children. It effectively criminalized the entire commercial infrastructure that Stead's investigation had exposed. The passage of this act, achieved in a mere 5 weeks of intense public pressure, stands as one of the most remarkable examples of the power of the press in British political history. Stead had correctly identified a moment of political vulnerability, with a weak caretaker government in power, and had manufactured a crisis so large that it could not be ignored. The mass demonstrations, the petitions, and the relentless daily pressure from the Gazette had made the bill's passage a matter of political survival for the government. The law was, in a very direct sense, a victory won from the pages of a newspaper, a triumph of public opinion over parliamentary inertia. While Stead's martyrdom was celebrated, the consequences for his collaborators were less glorious. Rebecca Jarrett served a harsher sentence, a reflection of the courts and society's unforgiving view of a fallen woman, regardless of her role in the reform. Her contribution was vital, yet her reward was a longer term in prison and a return to obscurity. The victory, in public memory, belonged almost exclusively to Stead. His 3-month sentence was a small price for a law that would bear his invisible signature for a century. From his cell, he could look out upon a nation whose laws he had single-handedly rewritten. The campaign was over, the battle was won, but the human collateral of his war was yet to be fully accounted for. While W.T. Stead served his sentence as a celebrated martyr and the Criminal Law Amendment Act began its slow, systemic work, the girl at the center of the storm remained in a state of profound limbo. For Eliza Armstrong, the conclusion of the trial was not a resolution, but the beginning of a new and permanent dislocation. Her life had been irrevocably cleaved into two parts: the 13 years of impoverished obscurity before the summer of 1885, and the long, complicated afterlife of being Lily, the national symbol of violated innocence. The legal system, having convicted her rescuers, now turned its paternalistic attention to her welfare, and in doing so, finalized the separation from her family that the sting operation had initiated. Upon her return from France, Eliza was not sent back to her parents in Marylebone. The court, having heard testimony about the family's poverty and her mother's acceptance of the £5, deemed the Armstrong household an unsuitable environment for her upbringing. In a final, crushing irony, the state enacted the very outcome Stead's committee had falsely promised Eliza was to be removed from her family for the sake of a better life. She was made a ward of the Chancery Court, a legal status that effectively rendered her an orphan of the state, with her parents' legal rights over her permanently severed. The Armstrongs, having lost their daughter first to a journalistic conspiracy and then to a public scandal, now lost her to a judicial decree. The responsibility for her future now fell to the very reformers who had orchestrated her ordeal. W.T. Stead, even from prison, and other members of his committee felt a profound and lifelong obligation towards her. Their solution was to provide her with the one thing her previous life had denied her: a respectable middle-class education. A fund was established, and Eliza was sent to a boarding school, and later to a technical college in Lincolnshire. This was not an act of simple charity. It was a continuation of the social experiment. The goal was to transform child into a respectable young woman, to prove that with the right environment and training, the cycle of poverty could be broken. This process of improvement, however, was also a process of profound cultural alienation. At school, Eliza was immersed in a world with different accents, different customs, and a different set of social expectations. She was being systematically stripped of the identity of her birth, yet she could never be fully integrated into the world she was being prepared for. The secret of her past was a constant, unspoken presence. While her guardians took pains to protect her identity, the notoriety of her case meant that the risk of discovery was ever present. She existed in a social no man's land, no longer a part of the working class from which she came, but forever an outsider in the middle-class world she now inhabited. After completing her education, Eliza attempted to construct a life of normalcy, a life that was her own and not the property of the public. She trained as a shorthand typist, a modern and respectable profession for a young woman of the era. In 1895, at the age of 23, she married Henry James Osmond, a man described as a stoker or engine fitter. The marriage appears to have been a stable one, and the couple went on to have several children. In these domestic details, a husband, a home, a family, one can see a determined effort to build a conventional existence, to bury the sensationalism of Lily under the quiet routines of a private life. Yet, the shadow of 1885 was inescapable. It is highly improbable that she could have kept the secret of her identity from her husband, and the story likely remained a guarded and difficult part of their shared history. For the rest of her life, she was Eliza Armstrong Osmond, a woman whose name, if ever linked to the scandal by a curious official or a long-memoried journalist, would immediately resurrect the ghost of her past. She was a living monument to a forgotten national crisis, a quiet suburban wife and mother who had once been the most famous and pitiable child in the British Empire. Eliza Armstrong Osmond died of pneumonia in 1929 at the age of 57. Her death went largely unnoticed by the public. The world had moved on, and the furious moral passions of the 1882 were a distant historical curiosity. The quiet, private end of her life stands in stark contrast to its explosive public beginning. She was the human cost of a great social victory, the individual sacrifice laid on the altar of a successful public crusade, but the person was required to live out the consequences for a lifetime. Upon his release from Holloway Gaol in early 1896, W.T. Stead was met not with the shame of a convicted criminal but with the adulation befitting a returning hero. He had served his time, and in doing so had completed the final act of his own carefully constructed narrative. His legacy, however, was far from simple. It was and remains a double-edged sword, a testament to the profound truth that a single act can be both a moral triumph and an ethical transgression. To assess the long-term impact of the Maiden tribute is to confront the uncomfortable calculus of the greater good, a calculation that rarely yields a clean or simple sum. On one edge, the sword is sharpened, gleaming with undeniable success. The Criminal Law Amendment Act of 1885 was a direct, tangible, and lasting consequence of Stead's campaign. It was not a minor piece of legislation, it was a foundational shift in the legal protection of children in Britain. The raising of the age of consent to 16 provided a legal shield that had been absent for centuries, immediately reclassifying thousands of acts of exploitation as serious crimes. It gave the police new powers and, more importantly, a new mandate to pursue offenders who had previously operated with near impunity. Social purity campaigners and child protection organizations now had a powerful legal instrument to wield in their work. The Act stands as a monument to the power of investigative journalism to effect immediate and profound political change. Stead had proven that a single, determined editor could, by harnessing public opinion, bend the will of a reluctant parliament. Furthermore, Stead's methods, for all their controversy, permanently altered the landscape of his profession. The Maiden tribute became the benchmark for a new form of confrontational, campaigning journalism. He demonstrated that a newspaper could be more than a passive recorder of events. It could be an active agent of social and political reform, a secular force for moral change. This legacy of the press as the Fourth Estate, as a watchdog and a catalyst, echoes down to the present day in every major investigative report that seeks to hold power to account. Yet, the other edge of the sword is jagged and stained with ethical compromise. The methods Stead employed established a troubling precedent. The entire operation was predicated on deception, from the lies told to Eliza Armstrong to the elaborate charade at the Poland Street brothel. He sanctioned an act of abduction and a technical assault, placing his own agents in profound legal and moral jeopardy. Rebecca Jarrett, the reformed precursess, was sent back into the world of vice and ultimately served a longer sentence than Stead himself, a stark illustration of the class and gender dynamics that even this crusade could not escape. The greatest cause was borne by Eliza Armstrong. In the service of a symbolic victory for all children, the rights and welfare of one specific child were systematically violated. She was purchased like an object, subjected to a humiliating physical examination, and placed in a situation of profound psychological terror. Her privacy was annihilated, and her identity was forever fused with a national scandal. Her subsequent life, while a testament to her own resilience, was a permanent exile from her origins, a life lived in the long shadow of her brief, unwilling celebrity. Her story serves as the permanent, uncomfortable footnote to Stead's triumph, a reminder that crusades for the abstract good are often paid for in the concrete currency of individual suffering. In the final analysis, the legacy of the Maiden tribute of modern Babylon is one of profound and irresolvable ambiguity. W.T. Stead exposed a hidden truth about his society, a truth so vile that its exposure was a moral necessity. He saved countless future children from a similar fate. But in his pursuit of that truth, he wielded a sword that cut both ways. He remains a paradox, a hero who broke the law, a savior who traumatized a child, a truth-teller who mastered the art of the lie. His story is not a simple fable of good versus evil, but a complex and disquieting study in the moral compromises that are sometimes forged in the fires of a righteous cause. The specific dates of the trial and the names of the protagonists now fade into the academic record. Stead, Armstrong, Jarrett, they become footnotes in legal histories and studies of Victorian media. But the essential dynamics of the story they inhabited do not recede so easily. They remain, suspended in the past like dust motes in a shaft of light, revealing patterns that are timeless. The Maiden tribute affair serves as a permanent, clinical dissection of the machinery of power and hypocrisy. It demonstrates how thin the veneer of societal decorum can be, and how easily it can be peeled back to reveal the brutal economics of desperation operating just beneath the surface. It is a case study in the immense, almost terrifying power of a controlled narrative to shape public reality, to create a crisis, and to force the hand of the state. A story, in the right hands, can be a weapon more potent than any law. But it also leaves us with a set of questions that resonate in the silence. What is the acceptable price for a necessary truth? When a system is corrupt and unresponsive, do those who seek to reform it have the right to operate outside its rules? And who bears the cost of these moral calculations? The answers are not found in the court records or the yellowed pages of the Pall Mall Gazette. They exist only in the uneasy space between what is legal, what is ethical, and what, in the final accounting, is just, and so we leave them to their fate. But ask yourself how thin really is the line between civilization and the savagery we just witnessed.